You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. And welcome to episode 46 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Carlton Shield-Chief Gover, and I'm thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. Today, I am joined by Dr. McKenna Litynski. Dr. Litynski is a North American archaeologist and received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Wyoming. She received her undergraduate degrees in 2021 from St. Mary's College of Maryland and double majored in environmental studies and anthropology and minored in museum studies. She received her MA in anthropology at the University of Wyoming in 2023. And as a master's student, she completed a thesis focused on analyzing the small remains from the Prele mammoth site to reconstruct paleo environments and to test if people 12,900 years ago were cooking and consuming these jackrabbits, ground squirrels, voles, etc., other small mammals and animals as part of their subsistence, which led to the article that we're talking about today. And she is also actively involved in zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, also known as ZOOMS. And currently, she is a postdoc in the CU Museum of Natural History at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast this evening. How are you doing, McKenna?
I'm great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Excellent. So today we are taking a break from our ongoing series of highlighting recent research in plains anthropologists, and we're turning to a new article by Dr. Litynski et al. That was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports, which is a very prestigious journal. And the title of that article is Anthropogenic Burning of Small Mammals at the Early Paleoindian Prele site in Converse County, Wyoming. Link to that article will be down below, as well as a full citation. And if you have a university access or institutional access, you can get to the article, or you can pay for a subscription to Direct. And I believe this is published by Elsewhere. Yes, it is. Cool. So, McKenna, I've had Spencer on and Maddie on, and we haven't actually talked about Prele. They've both Maddie's talked about Prele a little bit, but for our audience, could you help set the stage for us? Could you reintroduce the audience to Prele mammoth site, please?
Absolutely. So Prele is this really beautiful early Paleoindian site. It dates to around 13,000 years ago, and it's located in Converse County, Wyoming, so just outside of the town of Douglas. It's located on the southern edge of the Rocky Mountains, and it reflects this really beautiful riparian zone near this natural perennial stream. It feeds into a river called the North Platte. The site was originally discovered in 1986 when the bones of a mammoth were found eroding out of this alluvial terrace by the creek. And they were like, that's strange. What if there's archaeology? And indeed there was. So since its discovery, Prele has yielded at least 4 hearth-centered activity areas. So where people were living, cooking, and really just going about their life alongside this mammoth that they butchered. Then there's this diverse assemblage of artifacts. So there's bone beads, there's bone needles, there's this massive ochre stain, charcoal, lithic technologies. It's just this gorgeous site. And then we also have the remains of small and large mammals. And in an article by Spencer Pelton, who's the Wyoming state archaeologist, he also describes how this site confirmed that the actual site is a little smaller than a football field in its kind of length, which is amazing. And from the amount of artifacts, we estimate that there's about 30 people that lived alongside the mammoth during this really cold period in history known as the late Pleistocene. So it's great. We can learn about the first peoples of the Americas and everything about their lives.
That's awesome. And so even for a Paleoindian site, like a Clovis age site, the size of a football field is pretty big, especially if it's just one kill of a juvenile Columbian mammoth. Whereas when I think of other large Paleoindian sites, I'm thinking large bison kill sites that cover that area. But there's something special that you have the juvenile mammoth kill, and then the occupation of that human behavioral event spans as large of a football field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually, we estimate 2 to 3 different groups all congregating together, living alongside each other. There's clothing being produced, obviously food being cooked. It's just Yeah, there's so much going on at this site. Honestly, I think there's more than we ever will know because there's just an abundance of materials.
Absolutely. And so this is a clovage age site, but wasn't a Folsom point also recovered from the site itself?
It was, which was so surprising. And I was actually in the field when the Folsom point was uncovered. And I got to hold that fluted point in my hand. And I think we were all a little shocked. So yeah, it's also kind of this collision of different cultures. We have Clovis points and we have Folsom points. So we're trying to make sense of what this actually means. And I think Dr. Todd Survell is in the process of writing a paper that talks more about that too.
Excellent. And so kind of dialing us back a little bit, what do archaeologists mean when they use the term Paleoindian? Like we've used that term a couple of times to describe the period, but also the people themselves. So could you expand upon that for us?
Sure. So Paleoindian really refers to the first peoples that entered the Americas and subsequently inhabited this continent. So we're talking about people that either crossed the Bering Land Bridge or took the coastal hypothesis, whatever you believe in, they got here somehow. And it's between 14,000 and 8,000 years ago. Again, depends on the person you're talking to. Some people argue earlier. And it kind of represents these people that are in this new continent, in this new world. It's a colder period in history because it's the Ice Age. It's kind of the last point in the Ice Age. And they are living alongside these massive creatures on the landscape. So everything from Shasta ground sloths to mammoths and mastodon and saber-toothed cats, just these brilliant creatures that are now extinct. And they're very mobile across the landscape in trying to find these animals, take advantage of their environment, and truly just live in this uncharted world.
Excellent. And so talking about how they lived, what do we currently know about these early people, these first settlers of the New World? How do they live, how they travel, and utilize the landscape?
Right. So they primarily lived on, again, a more mobile system. And this often revolved around the manufacture of stone and bone technologies. So they would find lithic sites where they then could make stone tools, or they would use the bones of animals readily available to them and make these toolkits. And then they would use these toolkits for various purposes, whether that be the act of hunting, butchering, processing plant materials, working animal hide and ivory, and so much more. And oftentimes people believe that these people traveled in small groups, though at places like Prele, a few different groups likely came together to live alongside one another and this deceased mammoth. These people were highly in tune with their environment, so they were extremely knowledgeable hunters, and they often used atlatl technology, so you can think of those as spears, to take down massive megafauna like mammoths and mastodon. But sometimes they also made surprising and somewhat unpredictable choices. So, for example, the occupants of Prele, they specifically chose to craft their bone needles from the remains of jackrabbit, red fox, and some sort of felid. So it could be bobcat, lynx, perhaps puma. So ultimately, there's still so much left to learn and gaps to fill in regards to how these people live their lives. But ultimately, they lived this life of just, I think it's wonder. Like they lived this amazing life like 13,000 years ago, and it's incredible.
Excellent. And so oftentimes when archaeologists talk about Paleoindians, there is a pretty sizable group of archaeologists that work in that time period that consider especially Clovis-equipped Paleoindian populations being these specialized game hunters, which oftentimes gets involved with the overkill hypothesis. So, I mean, why do archaeologists during this time period often focus on large game animals when discussing Paleoindian subsistence?
Right. I think that's a really good question. And I think there's ultimately two main reasons why archaeologists focus on large game animals during this time. First, there is a lot of evidence of people during this period that hunted these massive animals on the landscape. So we do have the archaeological evidence for people hunting things like the mammoth and the mastodon. And so that's one side of this larger debate in archaeology, is this Clovis overkill or Clovis specialist hypothesis, where people are specializing in the hunting of large game and they're kind of ignoring the smaller game on the landscape. I think another side of the story, though, is this Clovis generalist side of the debates, where researchers are arguing that people weren't necessarily specializing in the hunting of only large game, but they were expanding their diets into the smaller animals. I think this side of the debates kind of, unfortunately, is less prevalent in terms of the literature, just because I think archaeologists have often focused on larger game simply because large game is flashy and it's cool. Oftentimes you don't see oil paintings or, popular media depicting Clovis people hunting rabbit because the modern public wants to see people hunting that really big mammoth on the landscape rather than a mouse or a vole. And so I think there's these two different reasons. One, we have the archaeological evidence for people hunting the large game, but also maybe the mouse isn't as cool as that mammoth. And so that mouse is often forgotten. And I think that's an issue because that mouse could have been part of this broader picture and part of these people's lives,
Absolutely. And that's what I love so much about this paper, right? Two of the major foci of Prele have been the mammoth kill itself and the ochre stain. And then you're coming back in with this, well, there's other things present. We need to analyze these microfauna. So what are microfauna in the archaeological record, and why do or should archaeologists pay attention to them?
Right. So there's actually many different definitions of microfauna depending on who you ask. But for the purposes of this paper, we define microfauna as any vertebrate animal that is around a jackrabbit size or smaller. And microfauna can be useful in several ways. A primary way that archaeologists use microfauna includes the fact that these animals are really great environmental indicators. They're really well understood for reconstructing what the environment and climate was like in the past. However, I do think there's so much to be gleaned about diet or even non-subsistence and cultural practices that involve the use of these tinier animals on the landscape, and more by simply taking a peek at how mice, voles, squirrels, small birds, and other small creatures kind of pattern themselves in the archaeological record.
Excellent. As we wrap up this segment, so what research question led you and your co-authors to investigate the microfaunal remains at Prele?
So the driving research question really revolves around that Clovis generalist versus specialist debate. In other words, are people eating these smaller animals at Prele, or is the bison and the mammoth and other larger animals at the site enough?
Excellent. And with that, we'll be right back for segment 2 of episode 46. Stay tuned. And we're back with Dr. Litynski, continuing on our conversation regarding the recent paper. And so setting us off for this next part, like getting into the study itself. So how do archaeologists determine whether small animal bones or these microfauna accumulated naturally or through human activity? And how did you explore this in your paper?
Right. So in the past, researchers have relied primarily on one, thermal alteration of the bones, so whether the bones are burnt or not. 2, the spatial association between these small remains and cooking features. And 3, if there's any presence of cut marks or other cultural bone surface modifications to justify the use of these smaller animals specifically as food. So in our paper, we actually test 4 different hypotheses with several different expectations. The first is that these burned microfauna could reflect natural fires, whether that's grassland fires or forest fires. In this case, we expected a more homogeneous distribution of the burned microfauna across the excavations, as opposed to kind of a tight spatial association with those cooking features. The second is a natural death of microfauna in underground burrows, followed by the construction of hearth features kind of accidentally over these animals. So in this case, we do expect to see some burning of animals in the hearth features themselves, but not high abundances of them. It's more of an accidental occurrence of them. The third is purposeful cooking and consumption of these small animals. So given the productive environmental conditions of Prele, it seems unlikely that the people that occupied Prele would have consumed these animals, but that's the question we're testing, right? So if the microfauna were pursued as food, then we expected a dominance of those larger-bodied mammalian taxa that fall under microfauna. So things like rabbits, as opposed to really small animals like the shrews and voles and mice. And we also expected to see high clusters, like a lot of density in terms of these microfauna around the cooking features. But finally, we also considered that maybe Laprelle's residents were using these microfauna for reasons unrelated to cooking and consumption, with examples including things like pest management or child's play or hunting practice. So in this case, we expect to observe still a significant spatial association of burnt microfauna in association with these cooking features, but we don't expect to see that taxonomic choice. We expect to see more diverse microfauna reflected in the assemblage. So those are the hypotheses and expectations that we were testing in this study.
Excellent. And so what evidence at Laprelle suggested that at least some of the remains, these microfaunal remains, were associated with human actions?
Right. So the way that we tested this is we looked at the taxonomic identification. So we identified what animals these tiny bones belong to. We also looked to see how spatially correlated these small bones were to the hearth features at Laprelle. And then we also pursued some burning experiments, which was so fun. I got to involve some undergraduate students in this. It was actually part of a zoarchaeology course that I taught. And the undergrads were so excited about this opportunity, and they're actually co-authors on the paper now. So basically, when kind of push came to shove and we looked at all of the data together, we found that for the most part, most of the microfauna reflects more natural distributions, probably a more natural deposition. However, over 1,000 microfauna bones did exhibit pretty high degrees of burning. And to me, that was an aha moment of, okay, something else is going on here, perhaps something cultural. And in addition to that, these things were clustered towards hearth features in pretty high abundances. So given that information, we're left with actually two hypotheses. We can automatically rule out two. And so the two hypotheses that we're left with include, okay, is it cooking and consumption, or is it non-subsistence discard of these animals? So people interacting with them in some way, but not eating them.
Absolutely. And I can totally understand how you were able to immediately rule out two of those hypotheses, right? So that first one being the natural burning, right? Because I imagine you expect like a charcoal layer across the entire site that would be representative, like a grassland fire or something like that. And then like if they're burned, clearly it's probably not a natural death or fortuitous burning in hearth features.
Right. Yeah. So in the case of a grassland fire, we expected kind of a random distribution of burnt microfauna remains across the site. And that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that the actual burnt microfauna are clustered towards those cooking features. And yes, if it was kind of an accidental, we built a hearth on top of a dead creature, we would not expect to see that density either. And all of this is kind of supported by those burning experiments as well. So in the case of cooking and consumption and the kind of purposeful discard of these animals into hearth features, that's really where we see the most burning, with the difference only being the types of skeletal elements that were burnt in the process.
Excellent. So what were those patterns of these microfaunal remains? So you already stated that there were clusters around the hearth features themselves, but was there a tendency towards some elemental features rather than other parts of the skeletons? Or are you seeing also large percentages of fully burned animals?
So essentially, we looked at not only our burning experiments, but also burning experiments from prior researchers. And in both cases, if people were intentionally cooking these microfauna, we would expect the appendicular skeleton to be burnt. So those limb bones, as opposed to kind of the ribs and the skull and other meatier portions of the body. Whereas if these microfauna were purposefully, discarded for pest management, for example, we would expect high degrees of burning on all elements of the body. And at La Prele, we're actually seeing a 50-50 distribution of axial and appendicular elements. So in other words, we're seeing the whole body of the mouse or whatever is being burnt, charred, as opposed to certain elements. So we're getting closer to saying, okay, maybe it's not quite cooking, maybe something else is going on, which is pretty exciting in my opinion.
Absolutely. So how many rodent remains did you guys actually pull out of the site?
That's a great question. Actually, I analyzed almost 5,000 small animal remains from La Prele. And this is across a couple different excavation blocks that I was looking at. But yeah, it was a lot.
And was there a particular species that was more represented than others? Or did you see kind of like a very evenly distribution of microfauna represented?
It was a pretty diverse assemblage of microfauna, actually. That being said, voles are actually the top species in terms of abundance at La Prele. So for a split second, I thought, well, perhaps people were cooking and consuming voles. There's actually a paper that's based in the UK that suggests people were eating and cooking voles. That being said, I don't think that's what's going on at La Prele, just because we're seeing different patterns in the archaeological record. We aren't seeing, certain skeletal elements being burnt. We're seeing the whole animal being burnt. And in addition to that, we also have to backtrack and remember that these people had a mammoth and several bison, as well as some other medium-sized ungulates readily available to them to eat. So to me, we can't discount the possibility that perhaps sometimes people consumed perhaps a vole, but it probably wasn't a main source of their diet in the past at La Prele.
Excellent. So what do you think happened? What caused this anthropogenic burning or human associated burning of these microfauna?
Yeah, so what I think is going on is that people are interacting with these microfauna in ways outside the realm of subsistence. So I really think people are either interacting with them in pest management ways, perhaps children interacting with these microfauna. Whatever it is, they're using these animals for some alternative purpose. And this is really where I took kind of a broader approach, and I actually looked at the ethnographic record within the Plains and Plateau region to say, okay, how were more modern Indigenous people interacting with these animals, and how is that reflected in the written record? And I found that out of 59 different cases of people interacting with certain species, only 15 directly documented these people consuming small animals. And out of those 15 cases, 9 basically said that it's only during times of starvation or times of desperate times call for desperate measures. There's a few cases where people did go after specifically microfauna because they thought it tasted good, or perhaps there was a chubby gopher on the hill and they were like, all right, we're gonna eat that. But that said, there's actually more accounts of people engaging with these microfauna in alternative ways. And so some examples include thinking of these animals as pests. There's women following the microfauna to their nests to steal the nuts and other fruits within the wood rat nests. There's accounts of people using small animals in medicine bundles and ceremonies and other magical forms. There's actually children that manufacture doll clothing from the skins of squirrels and other small creatures on the landscape. And I also really think it's fun to think about just children playing with these animals. So children making dice games out of their teeth, or there's also an account of small boys participating in kind of imaginary games of war. And then when they kill the gopher or the rabbit or squirrel, they hold it up in the air and they kind of sing songs of victory around camp. So I think many times archaeologists forget to think about these more playful ways that people interact with their environment and animals. And I think it's important to highlight how maybe the residents of La Prele were not so different, and they kind of were going about their lives in a more playful way as well.
Absolutely. That's such a great picture you've constructed for us on looking at past people, and that, like as archaeologists or anthropologists, and we're supposed to be talking about human behavior, not just, the caloric return of like a hunt, but also that there was a day-to-day aspect of these people's lives, from the children to the men to the women, and that there's so much room for activities that we can relate with that are occurring in the past as well. And so how can studies of microfauna analysis, just like this one, help archaeologists build more nuanced interpretations of Paleoindian camps and daily life?
I think that these kinds of studies are really important because this is one of the first studies to really shed light on small animals in ways that go beyond, like you said, that kind of caloric account or nutritional value of the animals, and instead considers a more holistic and cultural perspective on the ways that people interact with the small animals on the landscape. And so I would argue that there's a lot more future research that should be done. I do agree that people should go about analyzing microfauna in very systematic ways in order to say truly whether or not people consumed them or perhaps interacted with them in a different way. There's quite a few other Clovis Age sites that include microfauna remains, sites like the Aubrey site, Louisville, Blackwater Draw, and so much more. Actually, the Aubrey site in Texas offers one of the most strong evidence for perhaps subsistence use of microfauna. But once again, they're arguing this based on the burning of microfauna in association with hearth features. And so I think it's really important that we reflect on some of these sites, reflect on the interpretations, and evaluate them through a more holistic lens as well.
Excellent. Well, McKenna, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This was a fantastic paper to read. I really enjoyed it. And for our listeners, the full citation to this article is in the show notes, as well as a link to the article itself. Once again, McKenna, it was so great to have you. And we look forward to what you do next at CU Boulder and all the fun you get into with Dr. Will Taylor. And with that, we are out. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.